August 1944. Camp Swift, OW, Camp Texas. The train whistle cut through the Texas heat like a knife through butter. Inside the cattle car, Hans Muller pressed his face against the gaps in the wooden slats, trying to catch a breath of fresh air that didn't smell like sweat, blood, and fear. 23 other German soldiers crowded around him, some standing, some sitting on the floor, all wondering the same thing. What kind of hell awaited them in America? Hans was 24 years old, though he felt twice that age. The bandage on his left leg was brown with dried blood, and every bump in the track sent fresh pain shooting up his thigh. He'd been wounded 6 weeks ago in Normandy when his Panzer IV tank took a direct hit from an American Sherman. The explosion had torn through the armor like paper, killing his driver instantly and trapping Hans's leg under twisted metal. He still remembered the smell of burning flesh and diesel fuel mixing together in a combination that made him vomit even now when he thought about it. American soldiers had pulled him from the wreckage. That part confused him still. The propaganda back home said Americans executed prisoners on sight, shot them like dogs, and left them to rot in the French mud. But these soldiers had dragged him to safety, cut away the metal pinning his leg, and loaded him onto a medical truck. One of them, a kid who couldn't have been older than 18, had given him water, clean cold water from a canteen. "You're somebody's son," the American medic had said in English. Hans didn't understand the words then, but he understood the tone. There was no hatred in it, just exhaustion and maybe a little pity. Now, 6 weeks later, Hans stood in a train car in the middle of Texas, about to face whatever fate the Americans had planned for their prisoners. The other men in the car were quiet, lost in their own thoughts and fears. Some were younger than Hans' boys, really conscripted in the desperate final months when Germany was running out of soldiers. Others were older veterans of the Eastern Front with eyes that had seen too much death to fear their own anymore. The man next to Hans was Otto Schmidt, a former factory worker from Hamburg who'd been captured in France. Otto was 52 years old with gray hair and hands that shook slightly even when he wasn't cold or scared. He'd fought in the First War too, back when Hans was still learning to walk. "Do you smell that?" Otto asked quietly in German. Hans sniffed the air. Over the usual stench of unwashed men and the metallic smell of the train, there was something else, something that made his stomach twist with a feeling he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't fear. It was something stranger, something that pulled at memories from before the war, before everything had gone to hell. "Bacon," Hans whispered. "It smells like bacon." Otto's eyes widened. "That's impossible. Why would there be bacon in a prison camp?" Before Hans could answer, the train lurched to a stop. The sudden deceleration sent several men stumbling forward. Somewhere near the front of the car, someone cursed in German. Then the doors rolled open, flooding the dark interior with blinding Texas sunlight. "Out. Everyone out," the command came in heavily accented German from an American guard standing on the platform. "Form a line, no running." Hans grabbed his crutch, a rough piece of wood the medical staff had given him in the British hospital where he'd first been held, and hobbled toward the door. The sunlight was so bright after the darkness of the train that he had to squint. When his eyes finally adjusted, the first thing he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. A black man was standing about 20 feet away, wearing civilian clothes and an apron. And he was smiling. Not a cruel smile, not a mocking smile, but a genuine warm smile. The man raised his hand and waved. Hans stood frozen. For 6 years, since he'd joined the Hitler Youth at 14, he'd been taught that black Americans were slaves oppressed and brutalized by their white masters, living in conditions worse than animals. The propaganda films showed them in chains, being beaten, living in shacks. But this man was standing in front of what looked like a kitchen building, wearing clean clothes and waving hello, like they were old friends meeting at a train station. And that smell. The bacon smell was stronger now, mixing with other scents: coffee, fresh bread, something sweet that might have been cinnamon. "Move along," the American guard said, not unkindly. Hans realized he'd been standing in the doorway, blocking the others. He limped down the metal steps onto the dusty platform. The heat hit him like a physical force. It was different from the heat in France, or even North Africa, where he'd served briefly in 1942. This was a dry, oppressive heat that seemed to suck the moisture right out of your lungs. But the air was clean. No smoke from burning buildings, no smell of cordite or death. Just heat and dust and that impossible smell of bacon. Welcome to Camp Swift, another guard announced in German. This one was different from the first. Older, maybe late 30s, with the bearing of someone who'd been in the military long before the war started. He wore the insignia of a captain. I'm Captain James Patterson. I'm in charge of this facility. You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. That means you'll work, you'll eat, you'll sleep, and you'll be safe. No torture, no execution. You follow the rules, you'll be fine. Break the rules, you'll face consequences. Understood, the prisoners nodded. Some looked relieved. Others, like the man Hans would later know as Klaus Werner, looked suspicious. Klaus was a former SS officer, 30 years old, with the kind of face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile sometime around 1939. He stood near the back of the group, arms crossed, jaw clenched. You'll be assigned to barracks, Patterson continued. Then you'll have 30 minutes to clean up before breakfast. After that, we'll do a full orientation and medical check. Questions? No one spoke. Patterson nodded. Good. Follow Corporal Williams. The black man Hans had seen earlier stepped forward. Up close, Hans could see he was probably in his early 50s, with gray touching his temples and smile lines around his eyes. He gestured for the prisoners to follow him. Come on, gentlemen, he said in English. Let's get you settled. Hans followed, trying not to put too much weight on his injured leg. The camp stretched out before them, a collection of wooden barracks arranged in neat rows. It looked nothing like what Hans had expected. Where were the barbed wire fences? The guard towers with machine guns? There was a fence, yes, but it was maybe 8 feet tall. Nothing like the fortifications around the camps Hans had seen in Germany. And the guard towers were there, but they looked almost decorative, like someone had built them, because prison camps were supposed to have guard towers, not because they actually expected anyone to try to escape. As they walked, Hans noticed other details that didn't fit the narrative he had been taught. There were gardens, actual vegetable gardens with tomatoes growing on stakes and green beans climbing up trellises. A group of prisoners was playing soccer on a dirt field, laughing and shouting to each other in German. One of them waved to the new arrivals. Otto leaned close to Hans. This doesn't make sense. Where's the punishment? The forced labor. Maybe they're softening us up first, Klaus said from behind them. His voice was hard, suspicious. Don't be fooled. This is America. Everything is a lie here. Tomorrow they'll show their true face. But Hans wasn't so sure. He'd seen American soldiers up close now, both in combat and in the medical camps. They fought hard, yes, but he'd never seen them execute prisoners or torture wounded men. They followed rules. It was strange, almost disturbing to someone trained in the Wehrmacht, where rules were often suggestions and atrocities were just another part of war. They reached the barracks and Corporal Williams opened the door. Inside were rows of bunk beds, maybe 40 in total. Each bed had a thin mattress, a pillow, and a folded blanket. There were windows along both walls, currently open to let in whatever breeze the Texas heat would allow. And most shocking of all, there were no bars on the windows. Pick a bunk, Williams said in English, making gestures to help them understand. Washrooms are in the back. You got running water, cold and hot. Use it. You all smell like you've been living in those train cars for a month. Some of the prisoners laughed nervously. Hans found himself a lower bunk near the middle of the room and sat down carefully, testing the mattress. It wasn't comfortable by peacetime standards, but compared to sleeping on the ground in a foxhole or on the floor of a cattle car, it was luxury. The mattress was stuffed with straw, but it was clean straw, not moldy or full of bugs. Otto took the bunk above him. I don't understand any of this, the older man muttered. Where's the cruelty? Where's the hatred? Hans didn't have an answer. He was too busy processing everything that didn't fit with what he'd been taught to believe. 6 years of propaganda had painted a picture of America as a weak, decadent society on the verge of collapse, where the rich oppressed the poor, where racial violence was constant, where democracy was just a cover for Jewish plutocracy. But nothing he'd seen since his capture fit that picture. Breakfast in 20 minutes, Williams announced. Follow the smell. You can't miss it. As the corporal left, the prisoners began to settle in. Some headed immediately for the washrooms. Hans could hear the sound of running water and exclamations of surprise. One young prisoner, maybe 19 years old, came back with wet hair and a look of wonder on his face. Hot water, he said to no one in particular. They have hot water. In August. Why would a prison camp have hot water? Klaus scowled. Psychological warfare. They're trying to make us soft, make us forget we're Germans, forget our duty to the fatherland. But the young soldier just shrugged and went to find a bunk. Hans noticed that most of the younger prisoners seemed more curious than suspicious. It was the older ones, the ones who'd been in the party longer, who couldn't accept what they were seeing. Hans made his way to the washroom. It was basic but clean, with 6 sinks, 6 toilets and stalls, and 4 shower heads. Several prisoners were already washing their faces and hands. The water was cold from the tap, refreshingly so. Hans splashed it on his face, scrubbing away weeks of grime and sweat. When he looked up at the mirror, cracked but functional, he barely recognized himself. His face was gaunt, the cheekbones too prominent. His eyes had dark circles under them. He looked like a man who'd been to hell and was still trying to find his way back. But at least he was alive. That counted for something. 20 minutes later, the prisoners filed out of the barracks and followed their noses toward the mess hall. The building was larger than the barracks, with screened windows and the source of that incredible smell. Hans's stomach growled audibly. They entered the mess hall, and Hans stopped so suddenly that Otto bumped into him from behind. The room was set up with long tables and benches. That was normal enough. What wasn't normal was the food. Prisoners were filing past a serving line where American soldiers and civilian workers were loading trays with actual food. Real food. The kind of food Hans remembered from childhood, before rationing, before the war consumed everything. Hans grabbed a metal tray and moved through the line in a daze. The first station had eggs. Scrambled eggs, 2 scoops per person, yellow and fluffy and steaming. The second station had bacon. Thick strips of it, fried until the edges curled, glistening with fat. The third station had toast, actual white bread, toasted golden brown, with a pat of real butter melting on top. There was also coffee, hot and black, and a glass of milk. Fresh milk, cold from what must have been a refrigerator. Hans stood holding his tray, staring at the food like it might disappear if he blinked. This wasn't prison food. This wasn't even soldier food. This was the kind of breakfast his grandmother used to make on Sunday mornings before the war, when life was normal and the future seemed bright instead of dark. He found a seat at one of the long tables. Otto sat across from him, looking equally stunned. Around them, other prisoners were having similar reactions. Some dove into the food, immediately shoveling it into their mouths. Others sat motionless, staring at their trays, as if they'd been handed a puzzle they couldn't solve. Klaus sat at the end of the table, his face set in hard lines. "Don't eat it," he said quietly but firmly. "This is a test. Tomorrow they'll poison us, or they've already poisoned this batch. Why else would they feed prisoners like this?" A few of the younger prisoners looked uncertain, but Otto shook his head. "If they wanted us dead, Klaus, they wouldn't have pulled us out of burning tanks. They wouldn't have treated our wounds. They wouldn't have brought us here at all." Klaus glared at him but said nothing. Hans looked down at his tray. The smell was intoxicating. His mouth was watering so badly he had to swallow. He picked up his fork, speared a piece of bacon, and brought it to his mouth. The first bite exploded with flavor. Salty, smoky, rich with fat. It was perfect. It was exactly like the bacon his grandmother made, frying it slowly in her cast iron pan until it was crispy but not burned. The taste unlocked a flood of memories. Sunday mornings in Dresden before the war. His grandmother's kitchen with sunlight streaming through lace curtains. His younger sister stealing pieces of bacon off the plate when she thought no one was looking. His father reading the newspaper. His mother humming while she made coffee. All of it gone now. His grandmother dead from pneumonia in 1941. His sister killed in a bombing raid in 1943. His father conscripted at age 52 and sent to the Eastern Front, from which he'd never returned. His mother, last he'd heard, was living in the ruins of their house with his aunt, surviving on rations that barely qualified as food. And here he was eating bacon in Texas. Enemy bacon. American bacon. Bacon that tasted like home. Hans felt his eyes burning. He took another bite, then another. He wasn't crying. He couldn't let himself cry. Not here, not in front of the others. But something in him was breaking some wall he'd built to keep himself together through the war. Because if America could do this, if the enemy could feed prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers, then what did that say about everything he'd believed Otto was eating, 2 tears streaming openly down his weathered face? "My wife," he said quietly, "my wife used to make eggs like this. Before the rationing. Before everything." Hans nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He moved on to the eggs, then the toast. Everything was good. Not gourmet, not fancy, just good, honest food made with ingredients that actually tasted like food instead of sawdust and chemicals. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but after years of acorn coffee and chicory substitutes, it was ambrosia. The milk was cold and sweet and real. By the time he finished, Hans felt almost sick. His stomach, shrunken from months of inadequate rations, wasn't used to this much food. But he felt something else too, a confused jumble of emotions he couldn't quite untangle. Relief at being alive and fed, guilt at enjoying enemy food while his countrymen starved, confusion at the kindness being shown to prisoners of war, and underneath it all, a growing suspicion that everything he'd been taught about America might be a lie. Captain Patterson stood at the front of the mess hall and raised his hands for quiet. The room gradually settled. Patterson spoke in German, his accent marking him as someone who'd learned the language in school rather than growing up with it, but his words were clear enough. Gentlemen, you've had your breakfast. I hope it was adequate. You'll receive 3 meals a day of similar quality. This isn't a reward. It isn't special treatment. This is simply how we treat prisoners of war in America. You'll work for your keep, yes. You'll be assigned to local farms and ranches that need labor. The war has taken many of our young men overseas, and the harvest still needs to come in. You'll work 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. In return, you'll receive 80 cents a day in camp credit, which you can use at the canteen for tobacco, candy, writing paper, and other sundries. You'll also receive 3 meals a day, medical care as needed, and adequate housing. He paused, looking around the room. I know what you were told about America. I know what your propaganda says about us. Some of you probably think this is a trick, that we're fattening you up before the slaughter, or trying to break your will with kindness or some other scheme. I'm here to tell you the truth. We follow the Geneva Convention because that's what civilized nations do. We treat you well because you're human beings, even if we're at war with your country. And we do this because we believe that how we act defines who we are, not just what we say we believe. Klaus stood abruptly. This is propaganda. You're trying to turn us against our own country. Patterson looked at him calmly. What's your name, soldier? Oberscharführer Klaus Werner, SS Panzer Division. Well, Mr. Werner, you're free to believe whatever you want, but I'd suggest you look around. Look at the food you just ate. Look at the bed you'll sleep in tonight. Look at the men around you who are alive and healthy instead of dead in a ditch somewhere in France. Then ask yourself, if we're the evil empire your propaganda claimed, why would we bother with any of this? Klaus had no answer. He sat down heavily, his face red with anger or embarrassment, or both. Patterson continued, You'll be here for the duration of the war, and possibly some time after, depending on how repatriation is handled. I suggest you make the best of it. Learn English if you want. We have books in the library. Play sports. Write letters home. They'll be screened, but they'll be sent. Some of you will work in the camp itself. Others will work on local farms and ranches. You'll interact with American civilians. I expect you to be respectful. They've been asked to treat you fairly, and I expect the same from you. Any questions? A young prisoner in the back raised his hand. Can we really write home? Yes, once a week. Letters will be screened by our censors to make sure you're not including military intelligence, but otherwise you can write whatever you want. Even if we say good things about America, another prisoner asked. Patterson smiled slightly, even then. Though I imagine some of you might face questions from your government when you get home if you're too enthusiastic. A ripple of nervous laughter went through the room. It was a subtle acknowledgement of what they all knew, that the Nazi regime didn't take kindly to anyone who deviated from the official line. After breakfast, the prisoners were lined up for medical examinations. Hans waited his turn, watching as each man went into a tent where army doctors checked them over. When his turn came, a medic who couldn't have been older than 25 examined his leg wound. This is healing well, the medic said in English. An older German prisoner who spoke English translated. You were lucky. No infection. The British doctors did good work. But you're going to have a limp, probably for the rest of your life. The muscle damage is too extensive. Hans nodded. He'd already figured that out. But at least he had a leg. At least he was alive. You won't be assigned to heavy farm work, the medic continued through the translator. We'll find something else for you. Maybe work in the camp itself. Can you read and write? Yes, English. Number only German. Might want to learn. It'll make your time here easier. After the medical check, the prisoners were given work assignments. Hans was assigned to the camp library, helping organize books and newspapers. It was light work perfect for someone with a bad leg. Otto was sent to a cotton farm 5 miles away. Klaus was assigned to a cattle ranch, which seemed to infuriate him even more. The rest of the day passed in a blur of orientation. They were shown the recreation yard where they could play soccer or volleyball, the library which had more books than Hans had seen in years, including German language books and newspapers that were only a few months old, the canteen where they could spend their work credits, the chapel where services were held on Sundays for those who wanted them. As the sun began to set, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and red, Hans found himself sitting outside his barracks with Otto watching other prisoners kick a soccer ball around the dusty yard. "I don't understand any of this," Otto said. "They're treating us better than our own army did." Hans nodded slowly. "I know. Do you think Patterson was telling the truth about the Geneva Convention and civilized nations and all that?" Hans thought about the bacon, about the hot water, about the doctor who'd carefully examined his leg and given him advice on how to minimize the limp, about Captain Patterson speaking German to make sure they understood their rights. "Yes," he said finally, "I think he was telling the truth." "Then what does that make us?" Otto's voice was quiet, almost broken. "If they're the good guys, what does that make us?" It was the question Hans had been avoiding all day. The question that threatened to tear apart everything he'd believed for the past 6 years. He'd joined the Hitler Youth because everyone did. He'd believed in German greatness because that's what he'd been taught. He'd fought in this war because he'd been ordered to, because refusing meant death, because he'd believed he was defending his country against enemies who wanted to destroy it. But now he was sitting in Texas eating American bacon and being treated with more dignity than he'd experienced in years of military service. And the question Otto asked hung in the air between them like smoke. What did that make them? Hans didn't have an answer, not yet. But as the sun set on his first day in Camp Swift, he realized that everything he thought he knew about the war, about America, about right and wrong, was built on a foundation that was starting to crack. And that bacon had been the first crack in the wall. Tomorrow he would start work in the library. Tomorrow he would begin to learn what America really was beyond the propaganda and the lies. Tomorrow he would take the first step on a journey that would change not just his life, but the lives of generations to come. But tonight he was just a German soldier in a Texas prison camp, trying to reconcile the taste of home with the reality that home had lied to him about almost everything that mattered. The Texas sun was already brutal at 7 in the morning when Hans reported for his first day of work in the camp library. His leg ached from sleeping in an unfamiliar position, but it was a manageable pain. Nothing like the searing agony of the first weeks after his injury. He limped across the compound, past groups of prisoners heading out to their farm assignments, loaded onto trucks that would take them to cotton fields and cattle ranches across the county. The library was a small building near the center of camp, painted the same utilitarian brown as everything else, but with windows on 3 sides to let in natural light. Inside, it was cooler than outside, thanks to the shade and a pair of electric fans that rotated slowly from corner to corner. The room smelled of old paper and dust, a comforting smell that reminded Hans of the library at his school in Dresden. A young American soldier was waiting for him, a corporal named Thompson, who looked barely old enough to shave. Thompson spoke no German, but he'd been given a translated list of instructions to hand to Hans. The work was simple: organize the books by language and subject to repair, damage volumes with paste and cloth tape, help other prisoners check out books and return them. It was quiet work, solitary work, which suited Hans fine. He needed time to think. The library had perhaps 2,000 books split between English and German. The German section included classics by Goethe and Schiller, but also more recent works that had been banned back home. Hans found himself holding a copy of All Quiet on the Western Front Remarks anti-war novel that had been burned in the Nazi book burnings of 1933. He'd never been allowed to read it. His teachers had told him it was defeatist propaganda written by a traitor. He opened it to a random page and began reading. Within minutes, he was absorbed. The words on the page described the horror of war in terms that matched his own experience far better than any of the heroic propaganda he'd grown up with. The exhaustion, the fear, the way death became so commonplace that you stopped feeling anything at all. The way the reasons for fighting became less important than simple survival. Hans was so engrossed that he didn't hear footsteps approaching until a voice startled him. "That's a good book, but true." Hans looked up to find Bob Williams standing in the doorway, still wearing his kitchen apron. Up close, Hans could see the details he'd missed before. The man's hands were calloused from years of work. His eyes had smile lines, but also deeper creases that spoke of harder times. He was probably in his early 50s, though it was hard to tell. "I'm sorry, I don't speak English," Hans said in German, then realized how pointless that was. Bob smiled and made a gesture indicating he understood. He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, something he'd clearly prepared in advance. On it was written in careful German, "Would you like to come to my house for dinner Saturday night? Captain Patterson will bring you." Hans stared at the note, reading it 3 times to make sure he understood correctly. A black American was inviting a German prisoner to his home for dinner. It made no sense. None of this made sense. Bob pointed to the paper, then to himself, then made eating motions. Hans found himself nodding before his brain could catch up with his mouth. Bob's smile widened. He patted Hans on the shoulder, a friendly gesture that made Hans flinch slightly, not from fear, but from sheer surprise, and then left. Hans sat down heavily in one of the library chairs, still holding the note. His hands were shaking slightly. Everything about this place contradicted everything he'd been taught. Black Americans were supposed to be oppressed barely better than slaves, certainly not inviting enemy soldiers to dinner in their own homes. But Bob Williams didn't look oppressed. He looked confident, comfortable, like a man who owned his place in the world. The rest of the week passed in a blur of discovery. Hans worked in the library during the mornings, organizing and cataloging. In the afternoons, he began teaching himself English, using a German-English dictionary he found on the shelves. The language was difficult, full of irregular verbs and strange pronunciation rules, but Hans had always been good with languages. He started with simple phrases. "Hello, thank you. Where is the bathroom? I don't understand." In the evenings, he sat outside with Otto and some of the other prisoners, listening to their stories about working on American farms. The tales they brought back only deepened Hans's confusion about everything he'd been taught. The farmer gave us cold lemonade during the break. One young prisoner set his eyes still wide with wonder. His wife made it fresh. She brought it out in a pitcher with ice. "The rancher let me ride one of his horses," another said. "A beautiful quarter horse, well trained. He showed me how to rope cattle. He was patient, didn't yell even when I did it wrong. The family fed us lunch at their table," Otto reported. "Sat down with us like we were workers, not prisoners." The wife asked about our families back home. She seemed genuinely concerned. Only Klaus remained unconvinced. "It's all an act," he insisted, his voice sharp with anger. "They're trying to corrupt us, make us forget we're Germans. Tomorrow they'll demand we renounce the fatherland, you'll see." But tomorrow came and went, and no one demanded anything except honest work for honest pay. The prisoners worked, ate, slept, played soccer, wrote letters home. Some of the younger ones started learning English from the guards who were friendly enough. One group formed a choir and sang German folk songs in the evenings. The Americans let them, didn't even try to stop them. Saturday arrived faster than Hans expected. At 5 o'clock, Captain Patterson appeared at the library in a jeep. "Ready to go?" he asked in German. Hans nodded, his stomach tight with nervousness. He climbed into the passenger seat, and they drove out through the camp gates. It was the first time Hans had been outside the fence since arriving. The freedom of it, even temporary, made his heart beat faster. They drove through flat Texas countryside, past cotton fields and cattle ranches. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, bigger than anything Hans had seen in Germany. The sky was enormous, a deep blue that seemed to go on forever. After about 15 minutes, Patterson turned onto a dirt road that led to a small house. It was a simple structure, white painted wood with a covered porch and a neat yard surrounded by a white picket fence. There were flowers growing in beds near the house, and Hans could see a vegetable garden to one side. A tire swing hung from an old oak tree. It looked like 1,000 small American houses Hans had seen in photographs, the kind of modest but comfortable home that propaganda said was only available to rich white Americans, while everyone else suffered in poverty. Bob Williams came out onto the porch waving. He'd changed out of his work clothes into clean slacks and a pressed shirt. His wife appeared beside him, a woman about his age wearing a flower print dress. She was smiling too. Hans got out of the Jeep slowly using his cane to steady himself. His heart was pounding. This felt more dangerous than combat, somehow more disorienting. In combat, you knew who the enemy was and what they wanted. Here he had no idea what was happening or why. Patterson spoke quietly. Bob wanted you to see how normal Americans live. He thought it might help you understand some things. Just be respectful and open-minded. His wife doesn't speak German, but she's a wonderful cook. They walked up the path to the house. Bob shook Hans's hand, a firm grip that spoke of strength earned through labor. His wife introduced as Eleanor smiled warmly and gestured for them to come inside. The interior of the house was modest but comfortable. A living room with a sofa and two chairs, a rug on the floor framed photographs on the walls. A radio sat on a table near the window. Through a doorway, Hans could see a dining table set with plates and glasses. What struck him most was how clean everything was. The floors were swept, the furniture dusted, the curtains freshly washed. This was a home where people took pride in what they had, even if what they had wasn't much. Bob gestured for Hans to sit on the sofa while Eleanor disappeared into the kitchen. Patterson sat in one of the chairs and began translating as Bob spoke. "I wanted you to see my home," Bob said through Patterson, "because I think you were told lies about people like me, about what our lives are like in America." Hans nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak. "My father was born a slave," Bob continued, "born in 1850 on a plantation in Mississippi. He was 15 years old when the war ended, and he was freed. He didn't know how to read or write. He had nothing but the clothes on his back, but he was free." Bob stood and walked to a photograph on the wall, gesturing for Hans to come look. The picture showed an old black man with white hair and weathered hands standing proudly in front of a small wooden house. "My father worked as a sharecropper for 10 years, saved every penny he could. In 1875, he bought 20 acres of land, his own land. Then he bought 20 more. He built a house with his own hands. He married my mother, who had been born free in Texas. They had 6 children. I was the youngest." Bob pointed to another photograph, this one showing a family group. Bob as a young man, probably in his 20s, with an older couple who must have been his parents. "My father taught me to read, even though he never learned himself. He hired a teacher to come to our farm. He believed education was the key to freedom." He was right. Eleanor came out of the kitchen carrying a platter of fried chicken, golden brown and steaming. The smell made Hans's mouth water. She set it on the dining table and called them over. The table was laden with food, the chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, cornbread, a pitcher of sweet tea. They sat down, Bob and Eleanor on one side, Hans and Patterson on the other. Eleanor bowed her head and Bob said a prayer in English. Hans didn't understand the words, but he recognized the rhythm of it, the same cadence as prayers he'd heard in church back home. Thanking God for food, for safety, for blessings. When the prayer ended, Eleanor began serving the food, loading Hans's plate with generous portions. The fried chicken was crispy on the outside, juicy on the inside, seasoned with something that made it taste simultaneously familiar and exotic. The mashed potatoes were creamy and rich. The green beans had been cooked with bacon and onions. As they ate, Bob continued his story, Patterson translating between bites. "I grew up on my father's farm. I went to school, a colored school, but we had good teachers. I learned to read and write in English. I learned mathematics. When I was 18, I bought 40 acres of land adjacent to my father's property. I've been farming it for 34 years now. Cotton, mostly some vegetables." Hans swallowed a bite of chicken. "You own 40 acres? "Yes, it's mine. I have the deed in a safe box at the bank. And you can vote." Bob's smile faded slightly. "On paper, yes. In practice, it's complicated. Texas has poll taxes and literacy tests that make it difficult. But I vote when I can. It's my right as an American citizen." Hans tried to process this. The propaganda had said Black Americans were essentially slaves with no rights, no property, no voice in their government. But here was a man who owned land, who'd inherited land from his father, who sent his children to school, who voted in elections. It didn't match. None of it matched. "Were you told different?" Bob asked gently, "about people like me?" Hans nodded. "We were told that Black people in America were oppressed, that you lived in terrible conditions, that you had no freedom." Bob was quiet for a moment. "We face discrimination, yes. There are laws in some places that say where we can sit on a bus, what schools our children can attend, which restaurants will serve us. Life isn't easy, but we're not slaves. We have rights, even if we have to fight to exercise them sometimes. We own property, we vote, we raise our families. We have dignity. That's more than propaganda, said Hans admitted. Why do you think they lied to you, Bob asked. It was a simple question, but it hit Hans like a punch to the gut. Why had they lied? What purpose did it serve to tell German soldiers that America was falling apart, that its people were suffering, that its society was on the verge of collapse? And if they had lied about this, what else had they lied about? The rest of the meal passed with lighter conversation. Patterson translating stories about farming and weather and the small dramas of rural Texas life. Eleanor brought out a pie for dessert, apple pie with a flaky crust and cinnamon sweet filling. As they finished eating, Bob pulled out a small book from a shelf. It was a German language copy of the United States Constitution. I want you to have this, Bob said. Read it. Understand what America is supposed to be about. We don't always live up to these ideals. Sometimes we fail badly. But the ideals themselves are worth something. Freedom, equality, justice. These aren't just words. They're goals we're trying to reach. Hans took the book, running his fingers over the cover. Why are you being so kind to me? I'm the enemy. Bob smiled sadly. You're not my enemy, son. You're a young man who was told lies and sent to fight for those lies. Now you have a chance to learn the truth. What you do with that truth is up to you. On the drive back to camp, Hans was quiet, the small book tucked into his pocket. Patterson didn't try to force conversation. When they arrived at the gates, the captain finally spoke. Bob lost his oldest son in North Africa, killed by a German tank in Tunisia. Hans felt like he'd been punched. His son James, 22 years old, died in 1943. Bob wanted you to know that. He wanted you to understand that he fed you dinner and gave you that book even though your countrymen killed his son. He did it because he believes in something bigger than revenge. He believes in the American principles in that book you're holding. Hans couldn't speak. He walked back to his barracks in a daze, the book feeling like it weighed 100 pounds in his pocket. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile everything. Bob Williams had lost his son to German soldiers, and yet he'd invited a German soldier into his home, fed him, given him a book about freedom and equality. What kind of person did that? What kind of society produced people like that? Around midnight, Klaus came into the barracks from the latrine. He saw Hans was awake and sat down on the edge of the bunk. Where did you go today? Klaus asked, his voice suspicious. To Bob Williams' house, for dinner. Klaus's face darkened. You ate with a black man? In his home? Yes, you're being corrupted, Hans. This is exactly what they want. They're turning you against your own people. Hans sat up slowly. Klaus Bob Williams owns 40 acres of land. His father, who was born a slave, bought that land with money he earned as a free man. Bob's children go to school. He votes in elections. Everything we were told about America was a lie. It's propaganda. They're showing you what they want you to see. Then why did they tell me his son was killed by German soldiers in Tunisia? Why would they tell me that if they're just trying to make me like them? Klaus had no answer for that. He stood abruptly. You're weak. You've forgotten what you're fighting for. I haven't fought for anything in 6 months, Klaus. I've been a prisoner, and I've been treated better as a prisoner here than I was treated as a soldier in our own army. Klaus's hand shot out and grabbed Hans by the shirt. Don't say that. Don't you dare say that. It's true. When was the last time you had 3 real meals a day in the Wehrmacht? When was the last time you slept in a clean bed? When was the last time an officer cared whether you lived or died? We were fighting for Germany's survival. Were we, or were we fighting for a government that lied to us about everything? Klaus shoved Hans back against the bunk and stalked away. Other prisoners who'd been woken by the argument pretended to be asleep. Hans lay back down, his heart pounding. He'd never spoken against the regime before, not even in his own mind. It had been too dangerous, too unthinkable. But now, holding a copy of the American Constitution given to him by a black man whose son had been killed by German soldiers, Hans couldn't maintain the lies anymore. The next morning was Sunday. Hans had never been particularly religious, but he decided to attend the chapel service. About 30 prisoners showed up along with a handful of American guards. A chaplain, an American army officer who spoke fluent German, led the service. They sang hymns that Hans remembered from childhood before everything had become militarized and political. The chaplain's sermon was about forgiveness and redemption, about how God's grace was available to everyone, regardless of what they'd done. After the service, Hans lingered. The chaplain noticed and came over. "Something on your mind," Soldier Hans hesitated. "Father, what if everything you believed turned out to be a lie?" The chaplain sat down in one of the pews, gesturing for Hans to join him. "That's a heavy question. What specifically are you struggling with?" "I was taught that America was evil, that Americans were weak and immoral, that we were fighting for something righteous. But since I've been here, I've been treated with more kindness and dignity than I ever experienced in my own army. I ate dinner with a man whose son was killed by German soldiers, and he showed me nothing but compassion. I don't know what to believe anymore." The chaplain nodded slowly. "Let me ask you something. When you were fighting, when you were told all these things about America, did it feel true in your heart, or did you just accept it because everyone around you did?" Hans thought about it. "I never questioned it. Questioning meant death or worse. So I just accepted what I was told. And now you're in a position where you can question it safely. So the real question is, what do you see with your own eyes? What do you experience directly? That's more reliable than anything anyone tells you. But how do I know this isn't also a lie? A different lie to replace the old one you don't, not completely. But you can judge by fruits. What are the results of American principles versus the principles you were taught? Which society treats people with more dignity? Which one values individual freedom more? Which one is more honest about its flaws?" Hans pulled out the Constitution Bob had given him. "He gave me this. He told me to read it and understand what America is supposed to be about." The chaplain smiled. "Bob Williams is a wise man. That document isn't just words on paper. It's a promise. A promise that America doesn't always keep, but a promise it keeps trying to fulfill. We have serious problems with racial discrimination. We fail our ideals regularly, but at least we have ideals to fail. At least we admit when we fall short." Over the next several weeks, Hans threw himself into learning English and reading American history. The library became his refuge. He devoured books about the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Constitution, and Bill of Rights. He read about Lincoln and Washington, about Jefferson's contradictory legacy as a slaveholder who wrote that all men are created equal. He read about labor movements and women's suffrage and the ongoing struggle for civil rights. What emerged was a picture far more complex than any propaganda had suggested. America wasn't perfect. America wasn't. It had deep flaws, serious injustices, ugly chapters in its history. But it also had something Hans had never seen in Nazi Germany, a system that allowed people to acknowledge those flaws and work to fix them. People could criticize their government without disappearing in the night. The press could report on failures and scandals. Citizens could organize and protest and demand change. In early September, Hans was moved to a new job teaching English to other prisoners who wanted to learn. He'd become fluent enough to handle basic conversations, and his teaching skills from before the war came back quickly. Classes met 3 evenings a week in the library. About 20 prisoners attended regularly, mostly younger men who realized they might be in America for a while and wanted to make the most of it. Klaus tried to disrupt the classes, at first standing outside and calling the students traitors. But Captain Patterson put a stop to it, assigning Klaus to a work detail that kept him away during class hours. The disruption stopped. Hans also started working on local farms on weekends, his leg having healed enough to handle moderate physical labor. He was assigned to help Mr. Henderson, the rancher, who owned the quarter horses. Henderson was a man of few words but deep kindness. He taught Hans to ride properly, to rope cattle, to mend fences. During lunch breaks, they sat in the shade of Henderson's barn and ate sandwiches while Henderson talked about ranching and Texas and life. One Saturday in late September, Henderson did something that stunned Hans. He offered him a cigarette. Not a German cigarette or a prison cigarette, but an American Lucky Strike. They sat smoking together in comfortable silence, and then Henderson said in his slow Texas drawl, translated by another German prisoner who worked there, "You're a good worker, Hans. When this war is over and you go home, you remember that Americans ain't monsters. We're just people, same as you." Hans nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. That evening back at camp, Hans joined Otto and some others for their usual discussion group. They talked about what they'd learned, what surprised them, what confused them. The consensus was universal. Everything they'd been taught was either a lie or a distortion. My farmer's wife packs extra food in my lunch, one prisoner said. She knows I send some of my pay back home to my family. She wants to make sure I eat enough. The rancher's daughter is going to college, another reported. A woman. Going to university to study engineering. Can you imagine that in Germany? I saw a newspaper yesterday, Otto added. It had an article criticizing President Roosevelt's policies, just openly criticizing the president, and nothing happened to the journalist. They sat in silence processing this. In Germany, such criticism would mean arrest, imprisonment, possibly death. Here it was normal, expected even. Klaus appeared at the edge of their group, his face hard. You've all been corrupted, turned into traitors. Hans stood up. We're not traitors, Klaus. We're just seeing the truth. The real truth, not the propaganda. The truth is that Germany was trying to save Europe from destruction. The truth is that we were fighting for our survival against what Hans demanded. America wasn't threatening Germany. Britain wasn't threatening Germany. We started this war. Our government started it, and they lied to us about why. Klaus's face went purple with rage. You'll be dealt with when we return home. All of you. Traitors get what they deserve. Captain Patterson appeared seemingly from nowhere. That sounds like a threat, Mr. Werner. We don't tolerate threats of violence in this camp. Klaus glared at him, but said nothing. Patterson continued calmly. Gentlemen, you're free to believe whatever you want. You're free to discuss politics and history and whatever else interests you. That's what freedom of speech means. But you're not free to threaten each other. Mr. Werner, you'll report for a work assignment starting at 5 a.m. tomorrow. Dismissed. Klaus stalked away. The discussion group dispersed quietly. Hans went back to his bunk and pulled out the Constitution again. He'd read it 3 times now, but he opened it again and started from the beginning. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. A more perfect union. Not a perfect union, but a more perfect one. An acknowledgement that perfection wasn't possible, but improvement was. It was a fundamentally different philosophy from what he'd been taught, where the state was supposed to be perfect and infallible, and anyone who suggested otherwise was an enemy. Hans fell asleep that night with the book on his chest, dreaming of a future he couldn't quite see, but was beginning to believe might be possible. The news came over the radio on a Tuesday morning in early May 1945. Hans was shelving books in the library when he heard shouting from outside. He limped to the door and saw prisoners running toward the recreation yard where a loudspeaker had been set up. His heart pounded as he joined the crowd, fearing the worst. Captain Patterson stood by the speaker, his face solemn, but not grim. When enough prisoners had gathered, he raised his hand for silence. Gentlemen, I have an announcement from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. As of yesterday, May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then chaos erupted. Some prisoners cheered, others wept. Many stood frozen, unable to process what they'd just heard. Hans felt his knees go weak, and he sat down hard on the dusty ground. The war was over. Germany had lost. Everything he'd fought for, everything his friends had died for, had come to nothing. But alongside that crushing realization came another feeling, one he was almost ashamed to acknowledge: relief. Pure, overwhelming relief that the killing had stopped. Otto found him sitting there and pulled him to his feet. The older man was crying openly, tears streaming down his weathered face. It's over, he kept repeating. Thank God it's over. Klaus stood apart from the celebration, his face like carved stone. A group of hardline prisoners gathered around him, their expressions ranging from shock to fury to denial. Hans could hear Klaus insisting it was Allied propaganda, that Germany had secret weapons that would turn the tide, that the Führer had a plan, but his voice lacked conviction. Even Klaus must have known it was over. Captain Patterson raised his hand again. I know this is difficult news for many of you. You'll be allowed to write letters home today without waiting for your scheduled day. We'll do our best to get news about your families and hometowns. For now, you'll continue your normal routines. We don't yet know when repatriation will begin, but we'll keep you informed. As the crowd dispersed, Hans walked slowly back to the library. His mind was churning with questions. What had happened to Dresden? To his mother and aunt, were they alive? Was anything left of his home? And what kind of Germany would he be returning to? A Germany occupied by Allied forces divided, defeated. A Germany that would have to reckon with what it had done. Over the following weeks, news trickled in. The full horror of the concentration camps was revealed as Allied forces liberated them. At first, Hans refused to believe the reports. They had to be exaggerated propaganda to make Germans look like monsters. But the evidence kept mounting. Photographs, newsreel footage, testimony from the survivors, and from American soldiers who'd seen the camps with their own eyes. Captain Patterson organized a mandatory viewing of footage from Dachau and Bergen-Belsen. The entire camp was assembled in the mess hall, where a projector had been set up. Hans sat in the darkness and watched images that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mountains of emaciated corpses, living skeletons with hollow eyes, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoria still full of ash and bone. Hans ran outside and vomited. He wasn't alone. Half the prisoners were retching or weeping or sitting in stunned silence. This couldn't be real. Germany couldn't have done this. The nation of Goethe and Beethoven, the nation that had given the world philosophy and music and science, couldn't have committed such atrocities. But they had. The evidence was irrefutable, and Hans had fought for the government that did it. That night he lay in his bunk, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling. He thought about every battle he'd fought, every order he'd followed, every moment he'd believed he was doing his duty for Germany. And now he knew that his duty had been in service of the greatest evil the world had ever seen. I didn't know, he whispered to the darkness. I didn't know, but ignorance wasn't innocence. He'd chosen not to ask questions. He'd accepted what he was told because questioning was dangerous. He'd been a coward, and that cowardice had made him complicit. The chaplain found him the next morning sitting alone in the chapel. Hans was holding the Constitution Bob Williams had given him, reading it over and over as if the words could somehow cleanse what he'd learned. I fought for them, Hans said without looking up. I wore their uniform. I followed their orders. I'm as guilty as any of them. The chaplain sat down beside him. Did you know about the camp's number? But I should have asked. I should have questioned. Perhaps. But you were also a young man in a totalitarian state where asking questions could get you killed. That doesn't absolve you, but it provides context. What do I do now? How do I live with this? The chaplain was quiet for a long moment. You learn, you remember. You make sure it never happens again. You go home to Germany and you help build something better. That's all any of us can do. Hans received his first letter from home in mid-May. His hand shook as he opened it. The letter was from his mother, written in her careful handwriting. She was alive. His aunt was alive. Their house had been destroyed in the bombing, but they'd survived in the cellar. They were living in the ruins, scrounging for food, trying to rebuild. His father was still missing, presumed dead on the Eastern Front. His sister's death in the 1943 bombing was confirmed. Hans read the letter 5 times, memorizing every word. His mother didn't know where he was or if he was alive. The letter had been written to the Red Cross in hopes of finding him. She ended with a simple plea, "Come home, my son. Whatever happens, come home." He wrote back immediately, telling her he was safe, that he was in America, that he was being treated well. He didn't mention the camps. He didn't mention his crisis of conscience. He just told her he loved her and would come home as soon as he could. In late June, Captain Patterson called Hans into his office. It was the first time Hans had been inside the administrative building. Patterson gestured for him to sit. Your English has improved significantly, Patterson said, in German, though Hans could now understand basic English. I've been impressed with your work here, with your teaching. Thank you, sir. Patterson leaned back in his chair. Hans, I'm going to be frank with you. Germany is going to need people like you when this is over. People who can bridge the gap between the old Germany and whatever comes next. People who understand both German culture and American values. Hans didn't know what to say to that. Patterson continued, repatriation will begin in the fall. You'll be sent home probably by early next year. When you get there, Germany will be divided into occupation zones. The Americans, British, French, and Soviets will each control a sector. Things are going to be difficult for a while. Food will be scarce, infrastructure is destroyed, and there will be a reckoning with what happened. I've been thinking about that, Hans said quietly, about what I'll do when I go home. What have you decided I want to teach? Like I'm doing here, but in Germany, I want to teach young Germans the truth about democracy, about freedom, about what really happened and why it must never happen again. Patterson nodded approvingly. That's good. That's exactly what Germany will need. Have you thought about how you'll do it? The occupation authorities will be screening teachers carefully. I'll be honest about what I believed, about how I was wrong about what I learned here. If they don't want me to teach, I'll find another way, but I have to try. Patterson opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. I'm writing a letter of recommendation for you. It details your time here, your work, your transformation. It might help when you apply to teach. Keep it safe. Hans took the folder with trembling hands. Why are you helping me? Because you're proof that people can change. That education and exposure to truth can overcome propaganda and lies. You're going to be part of rebuilding Germany. Hans, make it count. In early July, Camp Swift organized a celebration for the 4th of July. For the first time, German prisoners were invited to participate fully in the American Independence Day festivities. It was voluntary, but most of the prisoners chose to attend. Even some of the hardliners went more out of curiosity than enthusiasm. The town nearest the camp, a small community called Bastrop, held its annual celebration in the town square. Families spread blankets on the grass for picnics. Children ran around waving small American flags. A band played patriotic songs from a makeshift stage. The smell of barbecue and apple pie filled the air. Hans walked through the celebration with Otto, both of them acutely aware that they were enemy soldiers being welcomed at an American patriotic event. It was surreal. A year ago, Hans would have said it was impossible. Now he was beginning to understand that America was built on impossible contradictions that somehow worked. An elderly woman approached them, probably in her 70s, with white hair and kind eyes. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "You boys look hungry," she said in English. Otto's English was still limited, but Hans could understand basic phrases now. "Thank you, ma'am," Hans said carefully in English. "You are very kind." She smiled and pulls back the cloth to reveal slices of apple pie. "My grandson is fighting in the Pacific. I pray every day that someone over there is being kind to him if he's captured. So I figured I'd be kind to you boys." She handed them each a slice of pie on a paper napkin. Hans took it, his throat tight with emotion. This woman's grandson was still fighting, still in danger, and yet she was feeding German prisoners with the hope that someone would show her grandson the same mercy. "Thank you," Hans managed to say. "I hope your grandson comes home safe." She patted his arm. "I hope your mama gets you back safe too, son. This war has taken enough boys from their mothers." After she left, Hans and Otto sat on a bench and ate the pie. It was delicious, sweet and tart, and flaky, exactly like the pie Eleanor Williams had made. Hans felt tears running down his face and didn't bother to wipe them away. "I don't deserve this kindness," he said quietly. "Not after what Germany did." Otto shook his head. "Maybe that's exactly why they're showing it, to prove they're better than what we became." As evening fell, the celebration moved toward its climax: fireworks. Hans had never seen American fireworks before. When the first rocket shot into the sky and exploded in a shower of red, white, and blue sparks, the crowd cheered. More followed, painting the Texas sky with colors and light. Children oohed and ahed. Someone started singing the Star-Spangled Banner, and the whole crowd joined in. Hans stood there listening to hundreds of Americans singing their national anthem, and he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't the weak, decadent nation he'd been taught to despise. This was a nation confident in its identity, proud of its principles, strong enough to show mercy to its enemies. A nation that could acknowledge its flaws while still celebrating its achievements. When the fireworks ended, Captain Patterson found Hans in the crowd. "Walk with me," he said. They strolled to the edge of the celebration, where they could talk without being overheard. Patterson pulled out 2 bottles of Coca-Cola from somewhere and handed one to Hans. Hans had tried Coke before at the camp canteen, but it still amazed him every time. The sweetness, the carbonation, the ice-cold refreshment. "What did you think of the celebration?" Patterson asked. "It was beautiful. Confusing, but beautiful. A year ago, I would have called all of this empty pageantry. Now I understand it's something more. It's people celebrating freedom because they actually have it." Patterson nodded. "Hans, I want to tell you something. This wasn't an accident bringing you to this celebration. Bob Williams suggested it. He thought you needed to see America at its best before you go home, so you'd have something to hold on to when things get hard. When I go home, Hans repeated the phrase. Sir, what will happen to Germany? Really, Patterson took a long drink of his Coke. Honestly, I don't know. The country will be divided. There will be trials for war criminals. Denazification. It's going to be painful and difficult. But I believe Germany can be rebuilt. Not as it was, but as something better. It won't be easy. It'll take a generation at least. But it's possible. What should I do when I get there? Tell the truth about what you saw here, about how Americans treated you, about what democracy looks like when it works. You'll face resistance. People won't want to hear it. Some will call you a traitor. But keep telling the truth anyway. Hans was quiet for a moment. Bob Williams gave me a constitution. You're giving me hope. I don't know how to repay any of this. You repay it by building a better Germany, by raising children who value freedom and truth, by remembering that enemies can become friends if we choose compassion over hatred. They stood in silence watching the last families pack up their picnic baskets and head home. Hans thought about his mother waiting in the ruins of Dresden, about the long journey home that awaited him, about the hard work of rebuilding not just buildings, but an entire society's moral foundation. I won't forget this, Hans said finally. Any of it. The bacon, the books, Bob's kindness, this celebration, I'll remember and I'll tell others. In mid-July, Hans received word that he would be repatriated in early August. He had 3 weeks to prepare. He spent those weeks saying goodbye to the people who had changed his life. He visited Mr. Henderson's ranch one last time. The old rancher gave him a cowboy hat, worn but well made. So you remember, Texas Henderson said through a translator. And so you remember that Americans aren't the enemy. We're just folks trying to live right and treat others decent. Hans accepted the hat with tears in his eyes. I will never forget you, sir. Never. His last English class was emotional. The 20 or so students who'd learned with him over the past months had become friends. They'd struggled through irregular verbs and idioms together, but more importantly, they'd helped each other process everything they'd learned about America and about themselves. What will you do when you get home? One young prisoner asked Hans. I'll teach. English, probably. And history. The real history, not the propaganda version. They'll call you a traitor, probably, but I'd rather be called a traitor to a lie than remain loyal to evil. The students nodded soberly. They'd all reached similar conclusions, though not all of them had the courage to say it out loud yet. Hans's final visit was to Bob Williams. Captain Patterson drove him to the small white house one more time. Bob and Eleanor were waiting on the porch, and they greeted Hans like family. Over dinner, fried chicken and all the trimmings, they talked about the future. Hans told them about his plans to teach about his hope to help build a democratic Germany. Bob listened carefully, nodding. You're doing the right thing, Bob said through Patterson's translation. It won't be easy. People don't like having their beliefs challenged, but it's necessary work. After dinner, Bob led Hans out to the porch. The sun was setting, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink. They sat in rocking chairs, and Bob lit his pipe. Hans, I want to tell you something, Bob said. When Captain Patterson first told me about you, about bringing a German prisoner to my house for dinner, I almost said no. My son James died fighting Germans in Tunisia. I was angry. I wanted to hate all of you. Hans felt his chest tighten. I understand. I don't blame you. But then I thought about what James was fighting for. He wasn't just fighting against Germany. He was fighting for the American principles we believe in. Freedom, equality, justice. And those principles mean treating people with dignity, even enemies. Especially enemies. Because that's when it matters most. Bob reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. It showed a young black man in an American Army uniform smiling at the camera. This is James. I want you to have this picture. Hans tried to refuse. I can't. This is your son. Take it, Bob insisted. Look at it when things get hard. Remember that his death has to mean something. If his death just leads to more hatred and more war, then it was wasted. But if it leads to understanding and peace, then maybe it counted for something. You can help make it count, Hans. You can help make sure the next generation doesn't repeat our mistakes. Hans took the photograph with shaking hands. He looked at James Williams' face, at the hope and determination in his eyes. This young man had died fighting Germans, and here his father was entrusting his memory to a German soldier. "I promise you," Hans said, his voice breaking. "I promise I'll honor his memory. I'll teach peace. I'll teach truth. I'll make sure what your sush fought for wasn't in vain." Bob nodded, satisfied. He pulled out one more thing, a small American flag, the kind children waved at parades. "One more thing, keep this too. Remember what America can be when it lives up to its best ideals. We don't always get there, but we keep trying. That's what matters." On the morning of August 15th, 200 German prisoners lined up for transportation to the port where they would board ships for home. Hans stood with his small bag of possessions, some clothes the Constitution Bob had given him, the photograph of James Williams, the small American flag, the cowboy hat from Mr. Henderson, and Patterson's letter of recommendation. Everything he owned in the world fit in one canvas bag, but it felt heavier than a full steamer trunk. The prisoners of Camp Swift gathered to see them off. Captain Patterson shook each man's hand as they boarded the trucks. When he reached Hans, he gripped his hand firmly. "Make us proud, Hans. Show them what you learned here." "I will, sir. Thank you for everything." Bob Williams was there too, having driven in from his farm. He and Hans embraced both men, fighting back tears. "Write to me," Bob said. "Let me know how you're doing. Let me know if you need anything." "I will." "And Bob, thank you. You changed my life. You showed me what it means to be truly free." The truck engine started. Hans climbed into the back of a canvas-covered vehicle, finding a spot on the wooden bench. As the convoy pulled out of Camp Swift for the last time, Hans looked back at the camp that had been his home for nearly a year. The barracks, the library, the mess hall where he'd eaten his first piece of American bacon. The soccer field where he'd watched men who'd been enemies learn to laugh together. The journey to New York took several days by train. Hans spent the time writing letters to his mother, to Bob Williams, to Captain Patterson. In the letter to his mother, he tried to prepare her for the man who would be coming home. Not the fervent Hitler youth boy who'd left in 1938, not even the disillusioned soldier who had been captured in France, but someone new. Someone who'd seen both the worst and best of humanity and was determined to help build something better from the ruins. The ship that would carry them home was a converted Liberty ship, crowded and uncomfortable, but safe. As it pulled out of New York Harbor, Hans stood on deck watching the Statue of Liberty recede into the distance. He thought about what that statue meant, liberty enlightening the world. He'd come to America as a prisoner and enemy. He was leaving as something else. Not quite an American, but no longer the German he'd been. Something in between, something new. The voyage across the Atlantic took 2 weeks. Hans spent the time teaching English to other prisoners who wanted to learn, discussing what they would do when they got home, helping those who were anxious about what awaited them in a defeated, occupied Germany. Klaus was on the same ship. He kept to himself, mostly surrounded by a small group of unrepentant Nazis who still insisted Germany had been right and the world had been wrong. Hans felt sorry for them. They were going home to a Germany that no longer existed, clinging to beliefs that had been thoroughly discredited. It would destroy some of them. Others would adapt eventually, but it would take time. When the ship finally docked in Bremerhaven in September 1945, Hans stood on deck, looking at the ruins of Germany. The port city had been heavily bombed. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the sky. Rubble filled the streets. People moved through the destruction like ghosts, gaunt and hollow-eyed. This was the Germany Hans had fought for. This was what his loyalty had produced. Destruction, defeat, moral bankruptcy. But standing there with Bob's Constitution in his pocket and James Williams's photograph tucked safely in his bag, Hans felt something unexpected: hope. Germany was broken, yes, but broken things could be rebuilt. Not as they were, but as something better. The processing took hours. Documentation, medical checks, assignment to occupation zones. Hans was sent to the American zone. The authorities gave him travel papers and told him to report to the local American headquarters when he reached Dresden. The train journey from Bremerhaven to Dresden took 3 days, traveling through a landscape of devastation. Every city was damaged, some completely destroyed. Refugees crowded the trains looking for lost family members or just trying to survive. Food was scarce. Hope was scarcer. But Hans had something most of them didn't: a vision of what could be. He'd seen a society that valued freedom and dignity. He'd experienced mercy when he expected punishment. He'd learned that enemies could become friends, that hatred could be overcome, that redemption was possible. When the train finally pulled into Dresden's ruins, Hans stepped onto the platform and saw his mother waiting. She was thinner than he remembered, her hair more gray, her face lined with suffering. But she was alive. She was there. They ran to each other and embraced, both sobbing. His aunt was there too, and they held each other in the ruins of their city, survivors of a catastrophe they'd helped create. His mother pulled back and looked at him. This woman who'd raised him, who'd lost her husband and daughter to the war, who'd survived the bombing and the occupation. She searched his face, seeing something different there, something changed. "You're home now," she whispered. "Tell me everything." And there in the ruins of Dresden, standing in the shadow of broken buildings and shattered dreams, Hans began to tell his story. The story of a German soldier who went to Texas expecting hatred and found bacon instead, who learned that enemies could show more kindness than friends, that freedom was worth fighting for, and that the human capacity for change was greater than any propaganda could suppress. It was a story he would spend the rest of his life telling. Hans did get his teaching position in 1947 after the American occupation authorities reviewed his case and read Patterson's letter. He taught English and history at a rebuilt school in Dresden, which was now in the Soviet zone, but where he was allowed to remain because of his clean denazification record and American recommendation. He married in 1948 a woman named Maria who'd lost her entire family in the war. Together they rebuilt a life from nothing. In 1950, Hans received a letter from Texas. Bob Williams, now 60, wrote to say he was well, that his farm was prospering, that he often thought about Hans and wondered how he was doing. Hans wrote back immediately a long letter describing his life in East Germany, the challenges of teaching truth in a society still struggling with lies, the birth of his son. He named the boy James after Bob's son. He sent a photograph of baby James wearing the small cowboy hat Mr. Henderson had given him, now carefully preserved. Bob wrote back 6 months later. He was deeply moved by the gesture. He enclosed a new photograph of himself and Eleanor, older now, but still smiling, still working their land. The correspondence continued for years, letters crossing the Atlantic twice a year, a fragile connection between two men from different worlds who'd found common ground in the most unlikely place. In 1961, the Berlin Wall went up. Hans and his family were trapped in East Germany. Life became harder. Teaching the truth became more dangerous. But Hans never stopped. He hid the Constitution Bob had given him in a false bottom of a drawer. He kept James Williams' photograph in a locked box. He taught his students about freedom and democracy, carefully, subtly planting seeds that might not grow for decades. His son James grew up hearing stories about Texas, about bacon and apple pie, about a black man who showed more kindness to a German prisoner than that prisoner's own government had shown its own people. James learned English from his father, read forbidden books, and dreamed of a different world. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Hans, now 69 years old, stood before his television and wept as he watched Germans stream through the opening in that hated barrier. His son James stood beside him, now 39, with children of his own. "It's finally happening," Hans whispered. "Freedom is finally coming." James put his arm around his father. "You helped make this happen, Papa. All those years of teaching, of keeping the truth alive, you planted seeds." Hans shook his head. "Bob Williams planted the seed. In a prison camp in Texas in 1944. I just tended it." In 1990, Hans wrote to Bob Williams using the same address he'd used for 40 years. He wasn't sure the old man was still alive, wasn't sure the letter would reach him, but he had to try. 2 months later, a response came. Bob, now 88 years old and in poor health, had received the letter. He wrote in a shaky hand that he'd never forgotten Hans, that he'd followed Germany's reunification with joy, that he was proud of what Hans had accomplished. "Come visit if you can," Bob wrote. "I'm old now, and I don't know how much time I have left, but I'd like to see you again, to see what became of that young soldier I fed chicken to all those years ago." Hans booked a flight immediately. In April 1992, Hans Muller, 72 years old, stepped off a plane in Austin, Texas. His son James, 42, was with him, bringing his own teenage son Heinrich to meet the man who'd changed their family's destiny. Bob Williams waited at the airport in a wheelchair, Eleanor beside him. When Bob saw Hans, he struggled to his feet. The two old men embraced, tears streaming down both their faces. "You came back," Bob said. "I promised I would." Hans replied in fluent English. They drove to the small white house, which looked almost exactly as Hans remembered it. A bit more weathered, the paint not quite as fresh, but still standing still home. Over dinner, Eleanor's fried chicken, they talked. Hans told Bob everything. About teaching in East Germany, about keeping the flame of freedom alive during the darkest years, about his son and grandson, who'd grown up hearing stories about Texas. Young Heinrich, 16 years old, listened with wide eyes. He'd heard the stories all his life, but seeing his grandfather and this elderly black man embrace like brothers made them real in a way they'd never been before. After dinner, they sat on the porch as the sun set, just as they had 47 years earlier. Bob's hands shook as he lit his pipe, but his eyes were clear. "Did I make a difference?" Bob asked quietly. "Feeding you dinner, giving you that book. Did it matter?" Hans reached into his bag and pulled out the Constitution, worn and creased from decades of use. "I've read this hundreds of times. I've taught from it, though I had to hide it for years. I've passed its lessons to my son, and he to his son. You didn't just make a difference to me, Bob. You made a difference to generations." Bob nodded, satisfied. James would have been glad to know that. His death meant something after all. They sat in silence as the Texas sky turned orange and red and purple. 3 generations of Germans and 2 old Americans who'd found something more powerful than war, more enduring than hatred. The next day, Hans and his family visited Camp Swift, now a historical site. They walked through the preserved barracks, the library where Hans had worked, the mess hall, where he'd tasted his first piece of American bacon. A plaque on the wall told the story of the camp, how it had held German prisoners during the war, how many of those prisoners had returned to Germany with changed hearts. Hans stood in front of the plaque and read it aloud to his son and grandson. When he finished, he added his own coda. "This is where I learned that freedom isn't just a word. It's a way of treating people. It's kindness to enemies. It's the courage to admit your own flaws while still believing in your ideals. It's what Bob Williams showed me, what America showed me, what I tried to show others for the rest of my life." Heinrich, 16 and idealistic, asked grandfather, "Do you think it's possible for enemies to really become friends?" Hans looked at the boy, seeing hope in his eyes. The same hope Hans had once thought was naive. But he'd lived it. He'd seen it work. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm living proof. Bob Williams is living proof. But it takes courage. It takes people willing to choose compassion over revenge, truth over comfortable lies, hope over cynicism. It's not easy, but it's possible, and it's worth it." On their last evening in Texas, Bob gave Hans one final gift. It was a letter sealed in an envelope addressed to Heinrich. "Don't open it now," Bob said. "Open it when I'm gone. It's for your grandson. Lessons I've learned in 88 years. I want him to have them." Hans took the letter, his hands trembling. "Bob, I don't know how to thank you for everything, for changing my life." "You already thanked me," Bob said, "by becoming the man you became, by teaching others, by raising a son who raised a son who still believes in freedom and truth. That's all the thanks I need." They embraced one last time. 2 old men who'd started as enemies and become brothers. Who'd proven that the human capacity for change was greater than the human capacity for destruction. Hans Muller died in 1998 at age 78. Bob Williams had passed 2 years earlier in 1996 at age 94. They'd corresponded until the very end, a friendship spanning 52 years and half a world. At Hans's funeral in Dresden, his son James spoke. He told the story of the bacon of Bob Williams of Camp Swift. He talked about how his father had kept the flame of freedom alive during the darkest years, how he'd taught truth when lies were safer, how he'd never forgotten the lessons learned in a Texas prison camp. And he read from the letter Bob had written to Heinrich, which the boy, now 22, had opened after Bob's death. "Dear Heinrich, you never knew me, but I knew your grandfather when he was younger than you are now. I want you to know that the kindness I showed him wasn't heroic, it was just human. The real heroism was what he did with it. He took a small act of compassion and turned it into a lifetime of teaching, of spreading truth, of keeping hope alive when hope seemed impossible. That's the power you have too. Every act of kindness, every moment of choosing truth over lies, every time you treat an enemy with dignity, you plant a seed. You might never see it grow, but it will. Your grandfather proved that. Be brave, be kind, tell the truth, and remember that enemies can become friends if we choose to make them so." With love and hope, Bob Williams. The letter became part of the family legacy passed down through generations. Heinrich became a teacher like his grandfather. His children learned the story. His grandchildren learned it too. And every 4th of July, wherever they were in the world, the descendants of Hans Muller raised a toast to bacon, to freedom, to Bob Williams, to the power of kindness, to change the world. The story of a German soldier who went to Texas and learned that everything he'd been taught was a lie, who found truth in the kindness of enemies, who discovered that redemption was possible, that people could change, that the human capacity for good was greater than the human capacity for evil. It was a story worth remembering, worth telling, worth living, because some lessons are too important to forget, and sometimes the smallest acts of kindness echo across generations, changing not just individual lives, but the course of history itself. That's what bacon and freedom did for Hans Muller. That's what compassion and truth can do for all of us if we're brave enough to choose them.